But without further ado, I want to turn it over to this incredible panel. Our moderator tonight is Greg Tito from Wizards of the Coast. Please give it up for Dungeons & Dragons Art and Arcana.
Hello, everyone. How are you? Woo. I think there's room for all of us to sit here. It's the D&D versus Art and Arcana panel.
Why don't you switch with me? You don't have to. There we go. All right. Thank you.
All right.
Now we're more integrated.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Edward. I am indeed Greg Tito, host of Dragon Talk, and I am joined by these wonderful gentlemen to discuss the Art and Arcana book, A Visual History of Dungeons & Dragons, and we'll get to all of that in a second. But before we do, I'll allow these amazing panelists to introduce themselves. Chris, why don't we start with you? You look the most uncomfortable.
Yeah. I'm Chris Perkins. I work at Wizards of the Coast and have been working at Wizards of the Coast for the past 20 years on Dungeons & Dragons, and I've played since I was 10 and DM'd for just as long.
Woo. Yes, excellent.
I'm Michael Witwer. I'm one of the co-authors for Art and Arcana, and I wrote a previous book called Empire of Imagination, which was a biography about Gary Gygax. So thank you for having me.
Hello everyone, I'm Jeremy Crawford. I'm the lead designer of the 5th edition Player's Handbook. I'm the lead rules designer of Dungeons & Dragons, as well as D&D's managing editor, which means I oversee all of the books we publish for Dungeons & Dragons.
Excellent.
Can I just say how much I love what you guys do on 5th edition? It is
thank
awesome and is my favorite. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you. Your book's pretty good, too.
I am Kyle Newman. I'm a filmmaker and one of the co-authors of Art and Arcana. Our missing party member is Sam Witwer, Michael's brother, who's here in spirit with us. Yeah, I've done films like Fanboys and Barely Lethal and music videos for Lana Del Rey and Taylor Swift, and I am adequately suited to talk about Dungeons & Dragons. No, I'm a lifelong fan, and I'm honored to be here. Thank you.
Good evening. I am Jon Peterson, and I study the history of war games and role-playing games. I previously wrote a book called Playing at the World about all of that. Oh, thank you, Playing at the World fans. Dedicated. And I'm thrilled to be here tonight. I'm part of the author team for Art and Arcana.
Excellent. All right, so I imagine that all of you have gathered here in this hallowed hall because you're fans of Dungeons & Dragons, and as are all of us up here. But Michael, why don't you tell us a little bit about what Art and Arcana and how that project got started and what it all meant to you guys getting together?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So Art and Arcana, it's got a long name actually. It's Dungeon History. So we got to talking, and he had recently read Empire of Imagination. And we decided there was a place for this, and actually it made a lot of sense. Of course, D&D is having a huge moment right now, and one that will hopefully continue to grow as time goes by. And so we assembled a team. We assembled a team that included Jon Peterson there at the end, who was a colleague of mine who I'd worked with closely in the past, really kind of the preeminent scholar of RPG history. And then I brought in my brother, who was someone who had worked with Kyle and had game mastered games of his, and someone who was kind of introduced me to the game originally. So it's kind of, to make a long story short, we got together and we decided, you know, we really want to make a visual history of this game, a book that is not just an art book, but one that tells the entire 45-year history of D&D as told through the visuals. And that's not just art. That's obviously art is a part of it, but that's ephemera, that's rare drafts and sketches, that's advertising, rare photographs. And we figured out over time that there was actually a pretty incredible story here that hadn't been told. And that's kind of how it all got started. So we reached out to, well, actually, the first call we made was to Chris Perkins.
Is that true?
Yeah, this is absolutely true. I knew Chris from cons, and had asked him whether there might be an appetite in Wizards to do something like this, at which point he said no. But he offered to introduce me to Liz Shue, your director of publishing, who had just been contacted by Penguin Random House, and they wanted to collaborate. And so it was really just a match made in heaven, and we really reached out at the right time. And the rest is kind of history. We had a contract pretty quickly, and from that point on, we rolled into this project.
And it was a very quick turnaround. I remember you guys coming to the office, was that about a year ago? And surfing through all of the archives.
2017, I think.
June 2017.
And that was earlier in our exploratory process because we got together in Los Angeles prior to that, and we met at my house, and we threw up thousands of images on a screen, and we just sat there for 2 days kind of going insane, but looking at everything you could possibly put in this book. And we quickly came to the conclusion that this isn't just the prettiest art. This is the most transformative, disruptive, descriptive art, and it's art that sometimes will appear on a box cover, and sometimes it's native form, which you've never seen, and sometimes it's a discarded concept. And I think it was like a healthy process to look at the art and these ideas from so many different angles, and we all brought personal experiences to it, so we could really vet it and say, what is the story behind this, and why is it going to get included? And we wanted the juxtaposition of images to also yield a story. So sometimes it's written, and sometimes it's visually told. And everybody brought like a really unique idea of what this book should be, and in a beautiful, organic way, we found this amalgamation, this new voice, synonymously to tell this. And I'm just, I was blown away, but every day I would learn something from Jon or learn something from Michael or see something in a new way just because we're finally seeing art that in its native form that you just, when you see it and experience it without trade dress and UPCs and spines, it takes on a whole new glory.
Right. And Chris, you've been a long-time fan of Dungeons & Dragons until you started working and writing the adventures, but seeing these images that are in Art and Arcana and the way some of the early adventures were illustrated, how did that reach you as a young kid?
Well, the art for me was pure escapism. It allowed me to create the worlds that would basically fuel my campaigns, my D&D campaigns for my entire life. One of the things that strikes me, though, is that when I look back at the early art, I'm not disappointed in it. It still has a magical quality to me that has survived, that speaks to the time it was made, but also just conjures wonderful imagery. And I think one of the great things about D&D is no matter how the art has changed over the years, there is something instantly relatable and magical about it. And that you can see the transformation in art now all in one place is really kind of special.
Right, because there has been a transformation from the 1974 version of Dungeons & Dragons through all of the editions up until...
One of the most amazing things about D&D is the elasticity of it, and how, if you just look at, like, for instance, Dragon magazine covers over the years, how flexible the art styles could be, and the sheer variety of artists that were tapped to help bring these worlds to life is really astonishing.
It really is. And and so up until now, when we're in the 5th edition of the game, was released in 2014, and Jeremy, you were instrumental in putting together those core rule books. So what can you tell us about, looking back at the history of Dungeons & Dragons, but then what talks about the current edition and what makes it special?
Well, if you compare 5th edition's art to the original editions, you're struck by how painterly the art has become. In the original art, so much of it was these simple...
Sorry to move ahead, Mike. I'm making you skip through so many slides.
We're zipping backward and forward through time. Our art now is so painterly, when the art in the past were these line drawings that sometimes almost looked like a child had taken a crayon.
It was a child, more or less.
Who colored them in. But the thing I love, as we were creating 5th edition, and so much of our work on 5th edition was actually about digging into 1st and 2nd and 3rd and 4th edition, poring over all of the previous editions of the game and seeing what were the greatest treasures in these previous editions, and how many of those treasures could we bring forward into the new edition. Our goal being, we wanted this to be everybody's favorite edition. And essentially, we wanted people to stop talking about editions and just talk about Dungeons and Dragons. And so to accomplish that, we felt we had to tap into what is the primal magic in this game? What is it that excited us in this game back when we were kids? I mean, I started playing this game when I was 6 or 7 with first edition, with my sister introducing it to me. And the thing we tried to preserve that's there, even behind this, the beautiful painterly art we now have, the thing we still have that you had way back in first edition with essentially this coloring book style art is this magical thing of you can create your own worlds, and also that D&D is this amazing mashup of things you would never expect to be together. Because some people often think D&D is, it's very serious, high fantasy. But then another group of people who plays D&D, it's farce, and with spaceships and laser guns and cowboys riding around on, talking cows and, practically sharks flying around with lasers on their backs. Like
I want to play in that game.
And
that sounds really fun.
and so D&D, it can have it all, because in addition to being a game, it's this cauldron of storytelling. And you see that going all the way back to the original, where it was just the original designers took Greek mythology, they backed up a truck filled with Norse mythology and several other cultures' mythologies, dumped in a bunch of 1960s and 1970s science fiction and fantasy, stirred it up, and we have this amazing stew that we're still sipping from, decades later.
It's amazing, yeah, and it is a delicious stew. And John, you had mentioned that, sorry to wake you up, but there was the discoveries that you guys made along the way, one of which we've talked about before, but is the young students that were tapped to draw some of the first, iterations of what these monsters ended up being.
Yeah, I mean, so we had the great privilege to work very closely with Wizards of the Coast on this project, and Jefferson Dunlap, who I see in the audience, their tireless pre-press and archivist, he gave us unprecedented access to all that Wizards had of product, let's say from 1997 forward. The problem is before that, it really was an archaeological process to try to uncover, because nobody knew this was going to be important at first, right? And I mean, it's hard to really overestimate just how primitive and homebrew D&D originally was. And so, when the original product was shipped in 1974, the art budget for it was around $100. They paid people $2 per image for the images that were contributed to it, and the majority of them were either local teenagers or even just relations of the Gygax family who were dragooned into defining this taxonomy of the fantastic, many of which were for monsters that Gary had invented himself. And so, I mean, they turned to all kinds of sources. They were inspired by comics. We have a story from Keenan Powell. It's very interesting, actually, that of the 4 main artists who worked on the original D&D, half of them were female. Actually, Keenan Powell was Mary Gygax's half-sister, Gary's wife, that is, her half-sister. And, she described to us going to the library to try to understand how to do a hippogriff. She's like, well, okay, there's like part eagle, part horse. Okay, so here's an eagle and a horse, and I'll kind of mash those together. And Greg Bell, who was a teenager from Rockford, Illinois, he was very, very, very inspired by Marvel Comics, by a particular issue, Strange Tales number 167, which was a split between Doctor Strange and Nick Fury, now household names at the time, still part of a pretty small and insular community. So, and we got to talk to Greg. We got to meet him. We got to ask him about his experiences working with Gary. So that part of this process of shining a spotlight on people that played such a foundational role in how this game started to visualize the fantastic, that was really rewarding for me personally.
That is pretty cool. And in 2018 dollars, that $2 is like $35 today.
It's at least $3.50.
Well worth. It's a 10. All right, darn it, you ruined my joke. Mike, tell a little bit about some of the stories that you gathered, not just from the people who were creating this art, but what it was like for the community of people. I mean, you encountered that when you were doing Empires of Imagination,
Sure.
but there was parts of that throughout this process that you guys found. So yeah, talk some of those.
I mean, this thing was full of surprises in every possible way. Well, you mentioned Empire of Imagination. So, you know, I've been studying this seriously from a historical perspective for, I don't know, 6 or 7 years now, and I've played the game my whole life. I mean, literally since I was probably about 6 or 7 years old, thanks to my brother. Thanks, Sam. What made it amazing is that when you looked at the history of the game through the lens of its visuals, you learned a very different story, one that we had never seen before. How the game reacted to certain things. Again, there's a number of situations where you see some cultural phenomenon happen, and then the game kind of takes a zig where otherwise would have taken a zag, and you can see that in its advertising, in the kind of imagery it's putting in its books. Some of the stories that I think were most meaningful to me, as John kind of suggested, was talking to some of these original artists who really have been since forgotten to D&D history, that did some really important things, because again, they were laying the visual foundation for what we understand these characters to be and these monsters to be. The one that I really, one of the ones that really stands out to me, in addition to Greg Bell and to Keenan Powell, a 14-year-old kid named Tracy Lesh. He was a local Lake Geneva boy who was in Elise Gygax's class. So this is Gary's daughter's class. And as the story goes, Elise saw him doodling one day in class and said, "You should talk to my dad." And so this is how Gary finds Tracy Lesh. Now, Tracy Lesh quickly gets conscripted to do illustrations for a role-playing game called Boot Hill, which is TSR's first Wild West role-playing game that they published in 1975. And shortly after that, we actually have a little bit of letter correspondence that helps us understand the dating on this. But Gary asks Tracy Lesh to draw panels for this tournament he's about to run in Baltimore, Origins 1 in Baltimore, called the Tomb of Horrors. And what Gary wants to do with the Tomb of Horrors is he's going to run a tournament. So it's a tournament format. It's pretty unusual by today's standards. 15 people in each group, 4 different dungeon masters. You play for 2 hours, and basically whoever survives, whoever gets furthest pretty much wins, is how this goes. And actually, an interesting context about why Tomb of Horrors is so deadly. Who here has played Tomb of Horrors? Okay, and who here has survived the Tomb of Horrors? Liar.
Liars.
I actually have.
Well, that's how he got hired at Wizards.
Right.
So
He knew the rules. He knew what was happening.
So you have this amazing story about both the context of now why Tomb of Horrors would be so deadly, A, and then B, what are these panels? So Gary asks this young 14-year-old to do 24 panels for the Tomb of Horrors. Why? Because Gary wants to create visual uniformity for the experience. He wants it to be competitive, but he wants it to be fair. So he's got 4 different dungeon masters running it willy-nilly, however they decide to run it. But at least if you can put the same panels in front of all the contestants, you can at least guarantee a certain level of visual uniformity. So 14-year-old Tracy Lesh is tasked with creating these early Tomb of Horrors panels, ones that would later inspire the super iconic panels we know today, such as the face of the Great Green Devil you see there. So things like that were an incredible story, an incredible find, and they added an entire new dimension about how we understand things like the super iconic Tomb of Horrors.
That's super cool.
And even that devil face survives beyond the game, because this was, if you're familiar with Ready Player One by Ernie Klein, in the novelization, the first challenge is the Tomb of Horrors in a Serac. And the movie version deviates, but the iconography remains in the film heavily in the 3rd act. You'll see homage to that demon face on the van driving around the entire 3rd act. So it's important that this one 14-year-old boy's image has endured all the way through up to this big Spielberg movie this year. So it's a pretty incredible story.
Yeah, and you guys had mentioned finding the advertisements and the way that Dungeons and Dragons was marketed at that time, and that goes beyond it being just a visual history of the things that were produced for the game, because some of those advertisements are lost. You can't see them. They were in a magazine, and then the magazine was discarded. And so you guys brought a lot of those advertisements to life in this book. And maybe, Jeremy, you could talk a little bit about that. Do you remember experiencing some of these advertisements in real time?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, one of my favorite things looking through Art and Arcana is actually looking at these old ads, because I have been working with the game books for years and years, either like working on them for my job or just as a fan. But I hadn't seen some of these ads since when they first came out and I was a kid. And my God, seeing them transported me back to the 70s and early 80s and really reminded me how culturally disruptive D&D was. Because at the time, when you saw D&D ads and then started seeing the books, it's really easy for us to forget now that there was nothing like D&D when it came out. Like, no game, no experience offered what it was that D&D offered. Now we take it for granted, and now we take for granted that there are hundreds of video games and other games inspired by it. I mean, honestly, the entire nerd industry, in many ways, is arguably the child of D&D. And back in those days, when we first started seeing those ads, there was this feeling of like something magical is happening, and these ads brought me back to that.
And ads have a funny way, too, of telling their own stories. So, I mean, we have 2 ads here that are from only a year apart. People here may have heard, and I know that we're in a church, that there was this satanic panic that surrounded D&D that really got started after the James Dallas Egbert disappearance in the summer of 1979. He was the kid who was supposedly roaming the steam tunnels, right? And there was this huge media furor about it. It turned out he'd just run away, right? But of course, there was really no media correction as such to that. But go back to the 2 ads. You know, this is a great example of once that brought D&D into the spotlight, once D&D had become, on the cusp of a mainstream phenomenon, you'll see that the kind of, the 1981 catalog that shows a gateway to adventure has this like devil face on it with devil horns, just like the Player's Handbook or the Dungeon Master's Guide would. But by 1982, things have changed a bit. Now there is Morley the happy wizard, who guides you to a gateway of riches and toys and so on. And this very much reflects, right, the fact that in that time frame, D&D had started to become under market pressure, right, both from their publisher, their distributor, and from parent groups around the country, to project to a younger audience. Their demographic had been kind of going in that direction. So the great thing about it, though, doing a book like this, is you can just put these 2 ads side by side. And it brings you back to that moment. And it shows you these just pivotal transformations in the brand.
Yeah, and how it was perceived, right? I didn't realize that was Morley. That's the Morley from the...
Morley, the wizard.
Yes.
To extrapolate on what Jeremy was saying, is one of the reasons why D&D 5th edition is also connecting with people is because there is the shorthand embedded in our culture. People are realizing, my God, I've been playing D&D my whole life, but under the guise of other games, or the terminologies there. Groundbreaking concepts such as leveling up and experience blew people's minds when it was introduced. And now we take it for granted because it's almost part of every game. So there's that wonderful culture, and then you have the streaming culture now, and you guys have harnessed it so well and been open to letting people express themselves with the game to showcase the potential of it. But people can see in 5 minutes what the game is, rather than piling all this stigma on it and all this intrigue. It's really like, oh, you get together with friends, you talk, and if you want to do something, you roll for it, and it's anything that can come out of my mind or my mouth, I can do. It's that free, and there's that unlimited imagination, and those barriers of entry are broken, and it's already in our culture on every level. So I think that's what's making this such a zeitgeist thing right now.
It's true. Yeah, I mean, I was at a convention. I grew up in the 80s, and many people in my community did not allow me to play Dungeons & Dragons, but in the 80s, I experienced all that, and then I had a strange experience 30 years later at a convention where I had parents coming up to me and seeing that their kids were fascinated with the miniatures and the dice that I had put out there, and the parents, every single one of them was like, how can I get my child to not look at a screen and play this game with their friends? They're talking, they're rolling dice, they're using math and all these other skills, and it was a little bit of a wow, that was a whiplash. 30 years, totally changed. I mean, and Chris, you and I were talking just backstage a little while about how, if you had thought even as little as 5 years ago that we would be at a similar convention last weekend with hundreds of people watching us play Dungeons & Dragons, it would have been, unheard of. And that as little as 5 years ago. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So I agree. I was at the start of the wave of D&D as a spectator event. And I DM'd the first podcasts for a group called Acquisitions Incorporated. Back when it was perceived that nobody wants to watch somebody else play a game, They want to play the game themselves. And I was in the camp that believed it was insane to do a podcast of us playing D&D and expect anybody to want to listen to it. But it turns out D&D groups, if you get the right people together, there's a magical chemistry that happens, and it can be very engaging. It is like listening to a radio play, if you're doing it as a podcast, and if you've got a really good group, it's as good as any TV series. It can be. A D&D story can be as rich and as layered and conjure as much visual imagery in your mind as you would get staring at a Game of Thrones episode or a Lord of the Rings movie. The fascinating thing about it, though, is that it's being conjured in the moment. It's a spontaneous creation, and a lot of D&D is spontaneity. And I think that's kind of what people are grooving on. Not only can they watch people to see how the game is played and realize, oh, it's so easy. It literally is, you don't have to be a master of the rules to get in. But they realize the visual, the joy of being able to watch this thing unfold before your eyes and be bombarded with all these great visuals of what these characters are doing in the moment. It's not like anything that they're getting anywhere else. And we put on live games now at Benaroya Hall in Seattle, and we pack the house.
Yeah.
And they're just watching us on stage improvising a story in costume, and we dress it up with some visuals, but it's just shared storytelling. It's a campfire experience with a budget.
And the budgets have grown over time. Mike, you mentioned throughout this book, not only do we talk about the advertisements and the tracing of the artwork, but also the video games and how in the 90s especially, they were in some ways the visual expressions that people experienced the most during that time period. And it all is traced in this book.
Yeah, we not only wanted to, of course, give you the visuals of the history, but also the visuals themselves. And many times in the game's history, the visual experience was more through visual games than through books. Starting here, what you see on screen there is Pool of Radiance, which was really the first blockbuster D&D video game. The Gold Box games, as some people know them as. And that was a Forgotten Realms kind of multimedia approach that kind of brought forth this new age for D&D. Now, this didn't sell as well as a number of the books of the time, but it sold a comparable amount. When you get 10 years later, you're looking at things like Baldur's Gate, which are literally selling 10 times as much as any D&D book was selling at that particular point. So we really didn't want to limit our search to things just like books and art, but really take you well outside of that, because again, the story of this game sometimes is really led by the visual experience. Today, it's very safe, as Chris was expressing. The streaming aspect is absolutely a crucial part of understanding why this is such a thing right now, right? The barriers to access have been broken. Mm-hmm. You've got this beautiful, elegant 5th edition rule set paired with the idea that you can learn the game in 5 minutes by watching a YouTube video. That has really solved a problem the game has had for literally over 40 years.
Yeah, that's true.
A quick note on that. This past year, the year past, was the first time when the number of people learning the game, let me rephrase that, for the first time, more people were learning the game by watching it online than they were from learning it from a family member. First time in the game's history.
It's incredible. Yeah, and that fact alone, I think, blew everybody away when we learned about that in the D&D team. We're like, that's. I don't think we ever thought that. I think we thought maybe there was an inkling towards it, and then having it occur. And I think it has to do with what you're talking about with the video games being so at this point borrowing so many tenets of D&D that were founded, when Guy, Jeremy, you and I have talked about, the video games that we like to play, and almost every one of them has its roots in Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, and I think because of all the video game playing that we have done and that everyone on our team has done and so many other gamers have done, it was hard for a lot of us to wrap our heads around people watching other people playing D&D, because we thought, well, wouldn't they rather, if they're going to be watching a game, wouldn't they at least want to watch a video game where there are amazing graphics and everything? And so it is kind of funny that, like Chris, I was also originally a big skeptic about, years ago when the whole penny arcade thing started, I was like, really? They're going to watch us roll dice? And because in a way also, so many of us were, we're the gamer nerds playing our strange game. And so it was just this odd notion that hundreds of thousands of people want to watch this. And now, of course, it makes sense because not only the improvisational nature, well, specifically the improvisational nature, because I think culturally right now, we are fed so many pre-packaged things. And D&D is and other role-playing games is one of the only forms of entertainment where not even the storytellers know how it's going to turn out. So it is as surprising as real life, yet with none of the real dangers. And so there is something especially powerful about that combination.
Agreed. And I think we're going to talk for about 5 more minutes and then have questions open up to you guys. So I know we're going to line up somewhere. There is a microphone. Edward's going to get you set up. So start queuing up if you would like to ask a question of this illustrious panel.
And people who ask questions are eligible to receive these amazing Tour of Horrors T-shirts.
Tour of Horrors,
Do
folks.
we have one out? Our
The
good
Tour
friend,
of Horrors.
Joe Manganello,
Death Saves.
has made us a tour shirt that looks appropriately 80s and metal. And so, yes, now, supplies and sizes are limited. At this point, we have been on the road for like 8 days, and we've given a lot of these away, but we have a lot still to give away. So.
While supplies last, folks.
Yes.
Question, come visit us.
And we will do our best to hook you up.
While everyone, looks like everyone's already queued up, but, well, that's a lot
People
of
like
questions.
T-shirts.
So I was just going to remark on the fact that we said Joe Manganello as that's nothing at this point because we are, of course, kind of at least friendly with him. But I think all of us were surprised to find out that someone of his career and stature is as much of a Dungeons & Dragons aficionado as all of us, and he's done a great job and started the idea that you can be a successful actor or creator in Hollywood and still love and learn about how storytelling works through this game. Maybe Kyle, you can speak to that for a little bit, because I've heard in Hollywood there are all these other Dungeons & Dragons games popping up all over amongst workers.
There are. Joe's got a good hub going on. There's an eclectic group that shows up in Joe's Gary Gygax Memorial Dungeon on a Sunday. Everyone from Taron Killam from Saturday Night Live to, you name it. People just come through and they want to check out the game, and some of them playing their whole lives, and some are brand new to it. But I think what's important is what you guys are doing in 5th edition. It isn't just the visuals that survive, and there's a reason why the Beholder keeps evolving, and Mind Flayers stick with the game, and they take on a new look with each time, but they're culled down to what is their intrinsic DNA. It's that you guys took something at a narrative level, and you extrapolated on it, and you said, these are also the special things that have resonated, be it Strahd or the Forgotten Realms and places within that. And what are those key storylines, and how can you elevate them without wiping away the past? And that's what's been wonderful to see, that this is a complete nostalgic look back at everything that meant something without discarding all those previous iterations. And I think that's great. And so many people cut their teeth storytelling with Dungeons & Dragons. And so many people credit that. Guys like Dave Mandel and Veep, and like I know Rainn Wilson and Joe, and people like Deborah Ann Wall. And people got enamored with this idea of storytelling, improv, and Dungeons & Dragons gave them the freedom and the confidence to do that and say, this is my story, this is what I want to do, this is how we do it. And you do it in a little group, and that's all you need sometimes, just a little family. And I think what it really is right now is it's bringing people together. It's analog. And that little community is precious. And if it's on a Tuesday night and you get your friends together and you can go do something that is so outside of your normal life, and it's okay, it's therapeutic. And we're discovering the therapeutic qualities of Dungeons & Dragons and role-playing at large. And so I think it strips away all those things like you're an actor or you're a celebrity. It just shows you that anyone can do this, and everyone should. If you have an inkling to it, don't be afraid of it. Just find a group you can go on to. I found my group for 5th edition. Sam Witwer, who's not here, our other author, was my game master. And we were doing Star Wars role-playing game. Don't hate me. But it was before I was back into Dungeons and Dragons, and I'm a lifelong Star Wars fan. And Sam went away to do a job, and I didn't want to cheat on our group and do another Star Wars game, so I picked up 5th edition, which was brand new. And I went online, and within an hour, I had a group of 7 people, just posted on Facebook. And my friends were like, I want to do it, or let's revisit it. And then we were playing that night. It was that quick and that easy. And I think it was because the spirit was already in the air, and it brought random people together. And that's what's awesome about it. And that's why
great.
Joe's a great spokesperson too, because he's kind of destroying the mold of what you expect in a Dungeons and Dragons nerd. It's really, a nerd is everyone. If you're into fantasy football, what is that? It's the same as Dungeons and Dragons. You're crunching numbers. So that's what's beautiful about it right now.
And what you guys have done through publishing this book and showing the creativity that was at every level is that it's this weird mixture of passive entertainment, because you're absorbing what we now create.
Chris has a good
create.
quote about that. The cup.
It's a mixture of the passive entertainment with the active entertainment.
Yeah.
The Dungeon Master and the players are contributing to the story together, and I think it's the only really medium where that exists.
Yeah, I was just going to say before we jump into questions that 5th edition has been so tremendously well received, but it could not have existed without 4th, which could not have existed without 3rd, which could not have existed without 1st, or 2nd and 1st. Everything that we've tried to do is basically building on the work of the giants that have come before.
And this book traces that.
Yes, it does. Beautifully.
All right, very well done. All right, go. If you want to come up and ask the first question, go ahead.
So my question actually builds on that. So you've said that a book like this has never existed before. How do you feel having the game's history can now affect developing the game's future?
We will continue to do what we did in the creation of 5th edition, and that is constantly look at the game's past as we build its future. Because for us, we view ourselves as stewards of D&D, and not just this game, but this beloved cultural phenomenon. I mean, it's why we're all here in this church tonight, because we love this cultural phenomenon, and we view our job as making sure, now that the game's had over 40 years, that hopefully we'll have another 40, as we create new things, but constantly also give new life to the old.
Thanks, Kelly. Excellent costume, by the way.
Thanks. I wondered if you could talk a little about, when you're talking about with 5th edition, kind of going back to the roots of D&D. Also, like one of the things that I think is so awesome about 5th edition is that there's greater human diversity in that, and it draws from so much more like cultural backgrounds and all of that stuff. So kind of fusing that with going back to these roots and bringing them together.
So a huge part of our project with 5th edition, and this connects to what I've talked about of looking at all the previous editions and sort of trying to make this the version of D&D that everyone loves. So a natural part of that project for us is making sure that then as many people as possible can see glimmers of themselves in our books, so that anyone who opens up our player's handbook, for instance, might see a character on the page where they then could imagine themselves being that hero. And that's why we were very conscious about having more female heroes in our player's handbook than D&D had ever had before, of having humans of a much broader range of ethnicities than D&D has ever had before. It's why we're very explicit in the player's handbook about talking about characters of different sexualities and different gender identities, to, again, make sure everyone knows there's a place for you at the table, but also to expand people's imaginations about the types of characters they can play, to really sort of blow it open and make people realize, yes, you can play an elf or a dwarf, but have you also considered there are wondrous humans next to you at the table, and you could actually experience what it's like to walk in their shoes while you play this game. And I think in many cases that's even more wondrous than I was a dragonborn.
Yeah. The other thing we tried to do is just embrace inclusion rather than exclusion. which manifests in some interesting ways, and we've had some great conversations about this, Jeremy, the chainmail bikini discussion,
Right.
which is chainmail bikinis were very much a feature of many early editions. They popped up in art all the time, and the artists just loved to paint them, apparently. With 5th edition, we decided in the inclusiveness argument, we would just say, we're not going to say there are no chainmail bikinis in D&D, because we have a history of them. But what we did say was, everybody gets to wear one.
Yeah.
I think
We're not going to use chainmail bikinis to objectify one kind of person over another. We're going to say if we're going to have them in the game, then we're going to open it up to everybody.
Yeah, it's something Kate Irwin, our art director, and I, for years now, she and I have joked about, that if our artists insist on putting female characters in the equivalent of chainmail bikinis, then we put our foot down and said, then we're going to see some men in them as well.
I think it's quite astounding and quite forward thinking
And
what
some
you guys
orcs
are doing
and some
with
gnomes.
this. Because we look at all the old games, we talk about how important and transformative and fresh it was and forward thinking. And what you guys are doing at the forefront of it is you are just laying down the gauntlet and setting a tone, I think, for greater culture and for all games to say this is how it should be presented, and this is how it should be portrayed, and these should be the barriers for entry. So I think that's just as important as what they were doing inventively in the old game. You guys are doing that and committing to it in your storytelling and your game mechanics, and that's a tremendous message. So, and it's easy when in Hollywood, people take over from somebody else, a new regime or a new edition or a new thing, and they just destroy everything that came before it. They just pillage it, raise it, stick their flag in it. And I think commendable what you guys did was you said, let's look at everything that came before us honestly and what worked, and let's bring that in openly. If the idea came from somewhere else, let's use it. It doesn't matter. Let's just bring it in and make it the best thing possible, which is also unheard of in the creative industry. So that's awesome as well. And thanks for your questions. Come on up.
Thank you so much.
Excellent. All right.
Hi guys.
Hello.
So D&D has inspired a lot of great art over the years. Of course, you can't go through the book and not want to draw. And of course, whenever you play the game, I myself am constantly sketching, and I notice a lot of other people are constantly drawing as they play. How about yourselves? Do you guys, other than writing, do you do any drawing or sketching? And have any of your drawings kind of like bore any kind of fruit to become something interesting?
I learned how to draw from like a nice balanced mixture of Star Wars. I could speak Star Wars words before I could speak English language. And Dungeons & Dragons Monster Manual. I was like Elliot and E.T. I was not allowed to play with my older brothers yet. They let me hang at Boy Scout camp while they did their own version of, they were so done with D&D, they also did like a Indiana Jones homebrew with TSR's old rules. And I would just linger in the tent and watch and trace monster manuals. And I would also read a lot of Marvel comics and swiped just like those early artists. So I can't not draw. If someone gives me a pencil, I have a problem. I'm just constantly drawing. That's how I learned how to storyboard and draw and paint. So that definitely was sparked by Dungeons and Dragons and this eclectic, quirky, catch-all environment and vibe. It's not like anything else. And you spoke about Dungeon Dragon magazine as well. Those early zines, that was the culture, and it was a showcase and a breeding ground for new talent and concepts, and it just lets you realize that you could go anywhere with this. And I think that was really important as like a 5-year-old hanging out with older people playing it and just drawing it even though I wasn't playing. And it's still something when I'm playing, I can't not draw, so it's always there.
And I'll piggyback my colleague. I didn't learn to draw from the game. I never was a great artist in any way, shape, or form. I'm a lefty for one thing. I know Kyle is as well. But I could never stop from. When you're a lefty, you smudge the ink as you draw left to right. I don't know if you know this. Any lefties in the house? Maybe a couple. Yeah, it's a terrible burden. You don't know what we go through as lefties. So I didn't learn to draw. But I did learn to imagine from the art and from the game. There is no question about that. I attribute so much of what I've done and what I was into early on as an actor and then turned into a writer and other things, whatever I am now. But it absolutely just, it engaged me in a really, really different way. I mean, so much so that, I spent my childhood poring over these these early 80s AD&D books, specifically the orange spine ones. I don't know if you know these. These have these great Jeff Easley covers. They're so immersive. There was a panel for the front of a book called Unearthed Arcana, which is this wizard with these wild, crazy eyes, and he's sitting in front of this spell book that's emanating this glow that's got this extraordinary forbidden knowledge aspect of it, right? But the scene is so immersive. The scene, it's got beakers, and there's little creatures in jars, and it brings you right into the scene. And as a matter of fact, the scene was so immersive, I was afraid to look into the eyes of the wizard. And I mean, this is a true story. This is during the Satanic Panic, right? I was actually afraid to look into the eyes of the wizard, though. I'd look at the scene, I'd look at this forever, because I thought it might have some dark power or something like that. But I also thought it was awesome.
It did.
Well, yeah, I know. And now I've learned it's true. No, but so it absolutely, I could look at these forever. And this, I think, these were the kernels of my imagination, personally, anyway.
Very cool.
I make maps.
Well, yeah, and I'll
Maps
always
all the
encourage you guys, as much as you write, please try and draw. It's a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.
As someone who's a bit of an aspiring writer myself, I've got to ask, what is the most challenging part of writing for D&D?
The most challenging part for me, writing for D&D, is sticking to my word count. Yeah, when you have a book, and Jeremy and I know this because we've put so many books together, we know how many words and pieces of art will fit in a given book, and I tend to overwrite quite a lot.
And then Jeremy has to cut it.
Well, no, he makes me cut it. Because my head fills with so many ideas.
His own darling.
Yes. My head fills with so many ideas, and there seems to be no bottom to this well that I just can't stop. And so that's my biggest challenge writing. I don't have too many troubles getting started. I'm not one of these people who stares at a blank page and doesn't know what to do. Mostly because I've thought about the project much longer than that. I'm eager to start writing it.
I think the challenge that many people have, including myself many years ago when I started writing role-playing game material, because before working on D&D, I co-designed the role-playing game Blue Rose, wrote for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, wrote for the role-playing game Mutants and Masterminds. When you first start writing for a role-playing game, it's very easy to come in and think sort of like a novelist or the writer of a screenplay, where it's like, I have a story to tell. And what you have to break yourself of is exactly that. You don't have a story to tell. You have tools to give your dungeon master, and they have a story to tell. And so you have to actually be a maker of story pieces and be able to equip your storyteller in as able a way as possible. And that can actually be a very difficult skill for a person to develop.
We've had novelists struggle with that, where we've said, okay, this product is like writing a novel, but now take away your hero.
Yes. Yeah. And you don't know how your own story is going to end.
And take away your ending, and take away any sort of presumption of what's going to happen in any given scene.
Thank you. Good question. Thank you.
Just
Sorry, John, did you have something to add?
a warning to the line that we now have no more smalls and mediums. Large enough is what we've got. So just be warned. Sorry.
Hi. So you guys have seen a lot of art, of Dungeons and Dragons. So other than the switch from line art to more like full graphics, what do you think the biggest change in the art has been from the original first edition to now?
What do you think, John? You haven't answered anything
I
yet.
mean, it's an utter transformation. So we could talk about analog versus digital, right? We could talk about, I guess maybe I'd say the most important thing is that the earliest artists had to figure out what like a beholder is, right? A beholder was a new thing. You couldn't look it up, not even in some medieval bestiary, right? Like maybe you could with a hippogriff or something like that. And so I think contemporary art gets to rely, again, this is to Chris's point, you're building on the shoulders of giants. The previous editions have gone so far to articulate the basic parameters of what these things are. Like we all know, a dragon can mean many things to many people, but if you say that a dragon is a small furry thing with a fluffy tail, people will say you're wrong, even though it's not real. They'll still say, that still sounds like it's false, doesn't it? So the sense in which the basic parameters were established, at least during the course of constructing the earliest art. But if you look in the book, you'll see things like early concept art for the owlbear that's really different from what later owlbears were like. So there was this period where there was like still push and pull, and that wasn't quite defined yet. So maybe that's the largest single difference that I'd say.
To me, one of the most delightful examples of how in the early days they were still figuring out what these things look like is if you go to the original white box, you will discover the bugbear, which had in that very first line drawing a jack-o'-lantern for a head. I'm not kidding.
Happy Halloween.
And a lot of the early art, it was instructional. It wasn't meant to be a majestic cinematic scene. They didn't have the tools or the craftsmanship. It was meant to say, oh, in this game, I can stab someone and take their money and show you that that is a game mechanic. So it was like a cave painting in a sense. It had a function more than it did to transport you. And I look at 5th edition art, and what I love about 5th edition art is it allows itself to be quiet and cinematic and show you post-battle, how you divvy up treasure, how you deal with a wounded person. And 4th edition was trying to capture and evoke something very different. And it was often like the Busby Berkeley of action movies, had everything going on in a frame, and it showed you just how dynamic and exciting and, you know, supersized weapons, and it was capturing and evoking something totally different. And the angles were isometric, and each one has a spirit to it. And there's like just a wonderful story that you can feel, I think, if you flip through the book, or you can read about, but it is something that exists, that became tangible by just aligning these pictures together.
2 art challenges that Jeremy and I are constantly talking about is quiet scenes, just immersive, beautiful landscapes, as opposed to, you know, creatures fighting. And then there's the old joke we have about the character illo of the character yelling.
Yes, oh God. If you go through the history of D&D art, it is amazing how many people are yelling.
They're pointing and yelling at something that you can't see.
Like, we need more action in this.
Yes.
Can you just make them pointing?
And I think, Chris, partly it's a sign that we've been working on the game for so long that basically we're exhausted by seeing pictures of people yelling. So again, we're like, close her mouth, close his mouth, enough. Why is everyone
It hit the
yelling?
peak when there was a guy riding on a horse, and not only was the guy yelling, but the horse was yelling.
Yes.
That's when we said, okay, we got to break the cycle. Yeah.
That's
Thank
awesome.
you.
Very good
Come-
question.
come get a
Interesting. Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Hi there.
Hello.
Big fan of what you guys have done. It's phenomenal.
Thank you for your question.
So, wow, I just lost what my question was. I'm nervous. I apologize.
All good.
Basically, big with the whole skepticism that was had with all like the streaming and everything that's been going on and how huge it's made it. Now you have things like it's looking like esports is a sort of format that seems to be having an interest in it. Do you guys have any, mainly to you two, Jeremy and Chris, do you guys have much input with what's going to be going on with any of that esports stuff or anything like that?
I mean, so I have the advantage of, for many years now at Wizards, being one of the people who gets to work full-time just on the tabletop role-playing game. So I hear about these things, but often I hear no more than you as fans hear when it comes to those sorts of corporate initiatives. But I will say there is no current plan for sort of a D&D esports thing. You might be thinking if there was a news story where something got garbled, where it was actually, I think, about Magic the Gathering.
Yeah.
And it got misreported as applying to D&D as well. But right now, the plan with D&D is just to continue our storytelling.
Well, and the thing that's interesting is that, you know, as we talked about here, there were competitive gaming was a part of the landscape in the early years of Dungeons and Dragons.
It was in its DNA. And I think speculatively, like, I don't know what's officially planned, but it's a rule set that can be used and interpreted in many different ways. And so I don't think it would supplant what exists. And it might be an exciting thing to see like Running Man type tournaments with your characters or groups. I mean, there's a lot of potential, and I'm sure they're going to harness it.
And when it's funny, in our team, when that story went out, and again, there was this confusion of, oh, is D&D going to be an esport? It then immediately caused us to brainstorm, what cool esport could
it be?
Could it be? But not with any idea that it would supplant the D&D that we know and love. It would be in addition to it, because actually, the D&D's competitive form hasn't been prominent in many years, but it is, as Kyle mentioned, it's in the game's DNA. I mean, tournaments were how not just Tomb of Horrors, but actually a number of the classic adventures started out as. Many of those adventures were play tested at conventions in a competitive format. And if you get your hands on some of those oldies, like including somewhat obscure ones like the Ghost Tower of Inverness, you'll even see how to score the tournament in these things.
Yeah, and what the DNA of that was always still cooperative. It was your party is working against other parties in the area to see how well they could do, how much treasure they could get, how many of the monsters they could kill. And I think that is still the nature that if we were ever going to do something like that, and again, there is no plans for it at all, but I think to me, D&D has become so much more about a team of adventurers working together to solve problems that we would want to make sure that was still there for anything like that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
What was that dungeon again?
The Ghost Tower of Inverness.
Perfect. I do a thingy every year.
Oh, cool. Oh, sweet. Thank you. Good question.
Module C2 by Alan Hammock.
Thank you, D&D bot.
Yes. There was just as a quick aside joke, there was a sign back there that said B5.
Yes.
And what Kyle asked Chris, what adventure was that again?
Yes.
What's B5?
Horror on the Hill by Douglas Niles.
Every time.
Yeah.
The book is fantastic. I was scared how many pictures I actually remembered. It's like, it scared me, but I still love it. Quick question for you. Culturally, what has changed from geek to chic? I mean, we used to get beat up for playing Dungeons and Dragons. Now, you're bigger than the quarterback. What do you think in your mind has changed in those 40 years that took us from the back room of the gaming club or the hobby store to the front room?
We are the quarterback.
Now we are.
What has changed?
I think part of what's happened is many of us have grown up and are now cultural influencers. I mean, it's not only the performers that have been mentioned over the course of this evening, but I mean, you even have someone like Stephen Colbert, who on his show, sometimes it's almost like someone's having to yank a cord on him so he doesn't geek out too much about D&D.
Yeah.
In some episodes.
Or it's half the people at Blizzard,
right,
who are.
It's many of the people who, they were us. I've now grown up and are making the decisions, and so D&D is this sort of cultural influence everywhere now.
And I would say also that the proliferation of fantasy movies, even superhero movies to a certain extent, has brought it out in all of us that we have these stories that mean so much to us, and the fantasy is so vivid in the last 15 to 20 years that now I think folks who watch those forms of entertainment, they want to now experience them, and the Dungeons & Dragons is the only way that you can kind of, for a moment, feel like you are slaying that dragon.
I think the people that played the game, it unlocked them in a way, it liberated them to go think differently than other people. So then when they got to a point where they could do things professionally, they chose paths that were atypical. And then those atypical paths yielded economic fruition, and they were able to determine culture, like you're saying. They became the cultural influencers, whether it's tech corporations or storytellers. And I'm a big fan of Star Wars and the Star Wars community. It's so many filmmakers cite that, and then they ran with that because it captured their imagination. So many storytellers were invigorated by Dungeons and Dragons, and they grew up saying, well, I can tell stories, and I can write stories, and I'm going to write a novel. And then they became the novelists, and those became the fantasy novels that we now turn into series. So it has this organic evolution, but it makes sense because it stimulated the imagination, and I think made them think outside of the box, and they're rewarded for it.
You know, and as an illustration, over the last 4 days, you know, we're on, well, maybe you don't know, we're on tour for this book, Art and Arcana. Over the last 4 days, we were at Pixar, standing room only, Lucasfilm, and Google today. So if that's an illustration that the masters of the information age grew up playing Dungeons & Dragons or play today,
But beyond
I don't know
that,
what is.
we went into every room and we said, who plays Dungeons & Dragons? And
everybody
but one person at Pixar and one person at Google raised their hand.
And we asked them to leave, incidentally.
And it was, and that's in a, we
But
were,
now they're
we
converted.
weren't
The peer
expecting,
pressure
like
that you're talking about.
99% type response. But the game is that pervasive. So, and these are the dominant creative and tech companies. So that I thought was mind blowing. And you know, we tried to show with this book is this is like a D&D yearbook. It's like all the greatest voices and creators and artists, and we showcase a little bit of everybody and show what their favorites are. And that's, you know, you're going to see there's so many different types of minds that worked on this game.
Excellent. Good question. Thank you for still playing.
And I just want to jump in saying we are running low on time. There's a lot of folks in line. I think we only really have time for 1 or 2 more questions. So a couple last announcements. As a reminder, copies of the book are available for sale. Afterwards, there will be a signing. And we did have a little drawing earlier, so I want to, while people are still here, just do that. We have 2 little piles of gifts for great goodies from Wizards of the Coast to give away. And the winners of that are Jason Smith. Is Jason Smith here?
Jason Smith, yay!
And the second pile is Katya Siza. Is Katya Siza? I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. Katya Siza? Are they here?
No Katya?
Oh, no Katya? Okay, well, I might need to go grab another one then. But Jason, I'll grab you after. Just come find me afterwards. Thank you. So we have time, I think, for 2 more questions.
2 more questions. Hi.
Hi, guys. Thank you. So I have a question more about the process of how you select art for your current work. So, like for Waterdeep, for example, is what I'm into, and I just love the full page spreads, and like I opened the art page or the artist note mentions, and there's like, I don't know, 20 or not that many, but so many. So what's your process? Like how much freedom do you give artists? When do the artists come in? Do you get several drafts? Like how does that all work?
So we have art directors on staff who basically work with art directors on the Magic team. We share artists often. Most of them are freelancers. And they're always just hunting. They're looking at new portfolios online, trying to find new artists who fit the types of projects that they're commissioning for. And every project has its own needs. They will get referrals from other artists. They will get referrals from other art directors that they know. And then they will tap these people to do 1 or more pieces in a given project. Now those tend to be pretty heavily art directed. They get an art order, an art description.
Which the adventure writer writes usually.
Somebody writes it. It depends, you know, different art directors work differently. But on the D&D team, typically, yeah, a writer writes up the art order, which is then vetted by the art director to make sure it has all the correct information that the artist will need. And that goes to the artist, and it basically defines the subject of the art and the story of the illustration. It does not paint the composition for the artist. So the artist has leeway as to how that scene is going to be represented or how that character is going to be represented. Certain details may be called out, like this will have a female character of African American descent as the central figure, and then some other details. Then once assignments are given out, contracts are sent out, and then the artist has 4 weeks to turn over a sketch. Then there's a review period internally where the art director and the designer and usually one other person looks at it, comments on it, make sure all the details are correct, make sure there's nothing that's violating our guidelines or missed opportunities. The artist gets the feedback, and then they take it to final, and they get about 4 weeks to take it to final. And the number of pieces can vary on a project. Typically, an art director will assign between 1 and 6 illustrations based on the artist's availability, time-wise. And there are exceptions. Cartographers, for instance, there aren't as many of those, so they tend to get bigger assignments.
John, did you find any, going back through all of the art and stuff that you find, did you find any of those processes along the way? Because I'd be really fascinated.
Yeah, I mean, there were a variety of, there's an example actually you can read online of a thing that I wrote that was dissecting the making of the module Quagmire. That actually includes, this is just, X6 is a pretty obscure module, but I just happened to be able to find like all of the paperwork for it. And so you can see precisely this in the mid-'80s, kind of at the height of TSR's powers then, the sort of art direction that would be given, the way that these modules were storyboarded out, but even kind of for the cover, this is the precise instructions for what we'd like to have. So there are examples of that survive, yeah. I don't know that we went into that level of detail in Art and Arcana. Some things are too arcane, even for a book called Art and Arcana. We'd rather show you pretty pictures of the player's handbooks and things like that than really bore you with too much of that. But you can find it in some of my stuff online.
If you're curious what our rates are, by the way, we pay $1,000 for a full-page color illustration, $3,000 for a full-page cover.
And if anybody's interested, artdrop@wizards.com is a great way to at least be like, here's some of my best work, and we art directors do look at that inbox and potentially find new artists that way. Yes.
Yeah, and to see that old process, John's blog, Playing at the World.
Blogspot or something.
Just Google the Quagmire thing. It's just a fascinating look at just one product from inception to the end, and he details it really well.
Blogspot. One more. Thank you.
As you mentioned, so much of D&D's world and art is original creation, and hopefully will continue to be original creation. And whenever I think of like, where it is and where it was, something that comes to mind is there's a new book. The new book coming out recently is Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica, which is Magic, the Gathering collaboration. And so, how do you think books like that, where it's collaborating with a different world and its art, is going to affect how D&D's world and art is going to evolve into the future?
So I was one of the 2 lead designers on Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica, and what's fascinating, because we share so many artists with Magic, as Chris mentioned, the art style is actually very similar to the art style of D&D. And as we pulled the book together, artistically, it actually felt like we were working on any other D&D book. The only difference when it came to the visuals is we had so much more art than we would have in a typical D&D book, because we not only commissioned new art for the book, but also had access to the many, many cards that had been painted for different Ravnica sets. The other amazing thing about creating that book is we went into the design process thinking we might have to create a lot of new game mechanics to fully realize this world from Magic the Gathering within the context of D&D. But the more we dug, the more we realized that the framework we created in 5th edition D&D was so broad that we were able to basically just scoop Ravnica up and plop it into D&D with almost no changes. And so it has actually laid some very interesting groundwork for what else could we do, given how seamlessly we were able to take this world that was created for another game and integrate it fully into Dungeons and Dragons.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you very much. Sorry, I think it's up to Edward, really.
Yeah, so that's all the time we have. So sorry for all the folks in line. The other drawing will now go to Ben Cameron. Is Ben Cameron here? Woo! All right, so Ben Cameron and Jerry come see me for a goodie bag. Everyone else, there's a signing right afterward. Thank you guys all so much.
Thank you for having us. Thank you to the fans who come out.
Keep playing D&D, everybody.